Welcome to the third American Economic Forum. According to a recent poll, nearly 60% of Americans believe that they would have been better off, the country was better off for people like them 50 years ago than it is today, going all the way back to 1973. And despite the recent economic numbers, 4.9% growth last quarter, many Americans are still feeling like the essentials of modern life, whether it's education, whether it's a home, transportation, are still out of their reach, and they're burdened with debt basically from womb to tomb. All this in spite of the fact that America was once and can still be again the greatest economic power on earth. Our country's middle class was the envy of the world, and we were a place where innovation, growth, and broad-based prosperity flourished like no other place on the planet. We at ISI believe that we can recover that dynamism in the American economy once again, but that will take addressing the core problems facing our nation head on, and that is exactly what we hope to do today at the American Economic Forum, whether it's social capital and family policy, artificial intelligence and human dignity, immigration and wages, inflation, the rise of China. The list could go on. We're going to tackle these questions head on, and we've assembled an incredible group of speakers and thinkers today to grapple with these questions. At ISI, we believe in exploring the permanent things, and we have a network of over 125 campus societies, over 80 campus newspapers, where we introduce students to the classic works of Western and American civilization. And today will be an exercise in applying those permanent truths to the present challenges that we face. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first group of panelists up to discuss social capital. And I will welcome Michael Toscano up, Executive Director of the Institute for Family Studies, to introduce our speakers this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Tim Carney's great book, Alienated America, which we'll be addressing momentarily. I want to take a moment to thank the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for organizing the American Economic Forum for the third year in a row, and I want to thank everyone here, especially the students for joining us today, wherever you may be. I'd like to say a little bit about ISI for those of you who are unfamiliar. ISI was founded in 1953 with William F. Buckley Jr. serving as its first president, and has been committed to the preservation of the permanent things that have allowed Western civilization to flourish, promoting ordered liberty and the cultivation of virtuous leadership. I have not been blessed to be a member of the ISI, one of those ISI students, but I have read a number of books published by ISI, and I'm greatly appreciative of it as an organization, and I'm a beneficiary of its work. Now I'll introduce our wonderful panel. Erika Bachiochi, who just arrived from the airport, is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, where she founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. A legal scholar who recently served as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, Erika works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, and pro-life feminism, with special interest in family policy. Her 2021 book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, was named a finalist for ISI's Conservative Book of the Year Award. Her work was recently covered on the front page of the New York Times, along with Oren Cass and Patrick Brown of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She co-founded St. Benedict Classical Academy in Natick, Massachusetts, Natick, which in 10 years has grown from 25 students to 250 with waiting lists. She and her husband are the happy parents of 7 children, ages 21 to 5. Tim Carney is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior columnist at the Washington Examiner. He's the author of 4 books, including Alienated America, which is right there, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse, and the forthcoming Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Makes Raising Kids Harder Than It Should Be. Tim and his wife Katie raise 6 kids 6 children in the Washington, D.C. area. And not to be outdone by Erika's New York Times coverage in April 2020, the paper referred to Tim's whole family as a brood in an essay titled, "What Everyone Can Learn from Parents of Big Families," which I think actually could be the subtitle for this panel, being that Erika has 7 kids and Tim has 6, and I have 3, under 5, so doing pretty well. But I think the 3 of us up here are Catholics, so happy Feast of All Saints Day to you all, being here in Catholic University of America. It's only appropriate to mention that. And I'll just give you a little bit of a roadmap for how this will go. Erika will come up. She'll give a presentation of about 10 minutes in length. Tim will do the same. And then they will respond to one another in about 4 minutes each. And then we'll have a conversation. So, Erika, why don't you begin?
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you, despite being held up on the tarmac for 45 minutes and then running down the street. Anyway, at the risk of appearing immediately ungrateful to the organizers of this really wonderful and much-needed event, I want to begin by suggesting that social capital is perhaps the wrong frame for what it is that Tim, Michael, and I are here to discuss. Now, I deeply respect the work of Robert Putnam, the scholar who has done much good as he has popularized the term. And as a college student, I actually cut my teeth on the communitarian movement in the mid-1990s, of which he was a key part. But appropriating this, well, neoliberal frame to describe the real public good of social trust and civic friendship would seem to grant that sociality is not quite natural to us as human beings, that our economics and politics will reap the dividends of investing in social capital gives the impression that human sociality is merely instrumental to econometric or democratic ends, or that sociality is something that we, putatively self-sufficient modern individuals, choose to enter into or voluntarily join, to name the recent documentary dedicated to Putnam's work. But that framing doesn't get human nature quite right, it seems to me. And the question of nature is an essential starting place for conservatives. For though we certainly aren't looking, as progressives are, to create out of whole cloth the ideal regime, we do want to orient our politics and economics toward the real goods of human flourishing. If each individual must simply be cajoled to join in, then the chronic loneliness of our time would seem to be primarily the individual's failing. But if we are naturally made for each other, for sociality, for friendship, then the epidemic loneliness is a wretched failure of civic, religious, political, and economic institutions. Because, of course, we human beings aren't the self-sufficient individuals of early modern imaginings, especially at our vulnerable beginnings and endings, but actually throughout the course of our lives. We are always and everywhere necessarily embedded in societies upon which we are inescapably dependent and to which we are deeply responsible. Because of the kind of being the human being is, each is born into and needs a family. And the family, which is essential but itself incomplete, depends upon civic, religious, and political communities for its own flourishing, to carry out the deeply human, formative work with which the family is uniquely and properly entrusted. Too often, policymakers think in terms of the individual, the market, and the state. And even if mediating institutions are remembered, as with Putnam, it's not the work of nurture and care in the family that is given pride of place in our political imagination. No, that work of the private sphere, has been far too often taken for granted. But if human beings really are to flourish, then we can't imagine that they simply emerge from the earth like mushrooms, in Thomas Hobbes' telling, and then go on to voluntarily form or join associations. No, the health of our families, where infants are nurtured and both children and their parents are formed, must be at the very center of our politics and economics. Of course, focusing on the family is not a new idea for social conservatives. The religious right, in particular, has long bemoaned the deleterious impact of the sexual revolution on the family. Now, some rather articulate thinkers from the left are coming around to the idea, as well they should. Our social, familial, and human ecosystems are just as, if not more fragile, than our natural ecosystems. And it's the most vulnerable who are the least equipped to protect themselves and their families from deteriorating social and ecological environments. But until recently, most on the political right have underestimated the way in which major economic transitions and dislocations both predated and then conspired with the sexual revolution to disembed our social and familial relationships. After all, the productive, deeply interdependent, and cooperative household was, for most of human history, the locus, indeed, the very origin of economics, and so central to how men and women ordered their lives and carried out their duties of care to one another and to their children. But the modern era cleaved economics from politics, work from home, man from woman, and finally, and most heartbreakingly, parents from their children. It seems to me that child-rearing families are still, more than a century later, working to adjust. So in my view, there are few better places to look for guidance than to those 19th and early 20th century social reformers who fought during a time not unlike our own to protect the culturally essential work of the home from the deracinating forces of their day. As leading labor advocate, Florence Kelley put it on the very first page of her 1905 book, Some Ethical Gains Through Legislation, quote, "The care and nurture of childhood is a vital concern of the nation." As more on the right are now beginning to see, I think, when we fail to affirmatively champion the essential work of the family, and not just rhetorically, our laws and policies will bend steadily toward the desires of the mythic, unencumbered individual. And so we'll find ourselves living in a regime that systematically disadvantages the vulnerable and the dependent and all those who care for them. And so today I think we ought to prioritize, in the words of Nobel Peace Prize recipient and Hull House founder Jane Addams, the family claim over the social claim. How might we do that today? Well, I don't think it's in seeking to return to the stopgap 1950s settlement of public men and private women, even if some families would and do happily arrange themselves that way. Indeed, in our post-industrial, technologically advanced economy in which women are as educated as men, and younger fathers, much like their agrarian predecessors, are increasingly invested in the care, nurture, and education of their children, determining who does what when with their particular gifts and constraints requires a practical wisdom that mothers and fathers must employ for the good of their families. But encouraging that wisdom requires law and policies that respect the work of the family as foundational to every social, political, and economic good, and thus respect the autonomy and responsible agency of each family to best organize itself according to its own concrete needs. Although culture is always the best mover of social norms, the state, the workplace, schools, and other institutions play key family supportive roles too. After all, incentives exist throughout society that tend to influence the decisions women and men make and are free to make in the tax code, in the job market, in corporate policies and public accommodations, in educational offerings, in housing and healthcare costs, in childcare regulations, and of course, in laws governing marriage and the duties of care in the family. Some cultural influences and economic realities forestall family formation altogether or make family life far more difficult than it need be. Though we certainly cannot grant every family a smooth path, nor can we compel men and women to prioritize the family claim over the social claim in their own lives, our institutions can remove some of the boulders along the way and spread the costs of care more fairly. And some institutions, like schools and parishes especially, can provide, I've personally found, support, guidance, and friendship for the self-sacrificing and ennobling work that is motherhood and fatherhood. We human beings are at our origins familial beings, beings who need, for their mature development, the give and take within families where each is properly responsible for the others. All policy is then, in one way or another, family policy. As such, the goods of the family should provide, as my colleague Patrick Brown has put it, the very logic of conservative politics. Only then can we hope to forge a humane regime that provides the just, stable, and peaceable conditions for women and men to carry out their sacred responsibilities to each other and to the beloved children in their care. Thank you.
Thank you to ISI for having me. Thank everyone for coming here. Thank you, Erika, not just for your great comments today, but as I've been writing my next book, I found that I had to shorten the quotes of yours that I was putting in my book because it was taking up an entire page and it was bordering on plagiarism. So thank you for those arguments. A year ago on this feast day, I was in Israel. And that's a memory that weighs heavy on my heart today. But also, since going there and talking about family and community and learning about it there, one of the things I've said when I speak about it at conferences like this is I said, if this conference were in Israel right now, there would be 4 or 5 little kids running around. So I want to thank those of you who brought the 4 or 5 little kids for making this alive. They say a parish, if it's not dying, if it's not crying, it's dying. And so I'm glad that ISI is crying rather than dying. So there's a social media website that used to exist called Twitter. And there's this Twitter tradition on Mother's Day of bitter journalists tweeting about what a dumb holiday Mother's Day is. And this year, one reporter said, Mother's Day, you do the hardest work in the world with 0 societal support, and you get a card and a brunch for it. And you understand what's trying to be conveyed here, but it fit into another Twitter genre, which was this one reporter I know, when he was expecting his first kid about a week before, he said, it was a 2-line thing. Google's the cost of a nanny, and then the next line is Google's socialism. A third thing on this same genre was a column by a Washington Post columnist right before she went on maternity leave saying, the reason I didn't have kids in my 20s or my early 30s was that I only made, X amount of money in daycare, costs half X, and unlike in England, we don't have free nannies, and unlike in Germany, we don't have free, and they went on about the lack of social support. And what all of these commenters were doing was that they were seeing only 2 things that Erika already referred to. They saw the state and they saw the market. And if it wasn't affordable on the market, the only answer was the state. My wife, who she will be hanging out with me tonight and partying, but when our kids were younger, we went through a lot of time where she was forced into missing the fun things in life, being a little more private, because parenthood of a young child can be isolating. But guess what? She would never say she had 0 social support, because she has sisters, she has neighbors, she has parishes, she has her kids' schools, etc. Most of Americans have social support that comes through community. All of these people, what they were missing was the middle, was civil society, was community. They were seeing only the market and the state. It's a very common error by the economic left to be materialistic in that way. See the market, the state, or the individual, but not civil society. But it's not just the economic left that makes that mistake. It is also, it's becoming an understandable mistake by a lot of the working class in America because, frankly, civil society, community, the institutions that tie us together have been withering away for decades. Robert Putnam most famously noted this in Bowling Alone 20 years ago, and since then it's generally gotten worse. And it's not just the working class, it's also true up and down and all across America. So we are connected to one another less. We do know our neighbors less. We belong to fewer things. We do less volunteering. And all of this has harmed us. Case in Deaton, the sociologist who noted the deaths of despair rising in the last couple decades in America, said a purely economic accounts for suicide or drug overdose or alcohol poisoning have consistently failed to explain the rise. J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, the surprise ending for him was when he realized that the other kids at Yale Law School, that their real privilege was connection. He thought it was weird that everybody was constantly schmoozing and interacting, and he realized, wait, this is how you succeed in life, is by belonging to things with other people. And sure enough, Raj Chetty, a great economist of our day, noted that the number one predictor of whether children will rise up through the ranks economically is the percentage of children in their neighborhood raised by married children, and the number two predictor is social capital. So, sorry to use that term, but that was Raj Chetty's term. The number two predictor is how much we volunteer, how much we belong to things, how much we are embedded in our community. So the core problems, Johnny said we're going to talk about the core problems facing America today. The core problem in America today is the collapse of community institutions and our lack of belonging. That is the main story of the last 60 years in America. That's why I wrote Alienated America. And the fundamental part of that coming apart is the de-churching of America. If you look at the cover of Alienated America, it's not a shuttered factory, it's a shuttered church. The church is a fundamental institution of civil society for the middle class and the working class throughout American history. As people have fallen away from it, whether they've secularized or they've individualized their faith, and that latter one is a bigger story if we're talking about kind of conservatism in America, secularized or individualized our faith, we've fallen away from the church and we've suffered. And what are the causes? Well, there's lots of them, and we'll talk about them. But the collapse in marriage and the collapse in the birth rate in the United States are fundamentally stories of the collapse of civil society. They're not economic stories as much as they're cultural stories. Economics matters. Economics will be part of the solution. That's one of the things I hope we'll talk about here. But they're fundamentally cultural issues. What have been the enemies of civil society? Well, secularization is one of them. Our government and our media are dedicated to the idea that religion belongs only in the private sphere. Nancy Pelosi once said, "I do my religion on Sundays." This was part of her defense of the Obama administration's persecution of the Little Sisters of the Poor. I do my religion on Sundays. You can't do your religion on Sundays. If you're Jewish, you can't do your religion only on the Sabbath, and if you're Muslim, you can't do your religion only at noon on Fridays. It has to be the way you live your life. Driving the church out of the public square has harmed the church, and thus it has harmed the working class and the middle class. But to step back a little bit, the real enemies is a combination of hyper-individualism and over-centralization. And it's easy to think that these are two different things, right? Atomization and over-centralization. Ayn Rand would tell us that the individualism and collectivism are opposite forces. Tocqueville tells us, so, that they're two sides of the same coin. That as the individual gets separated from his neighbors for a variety of reasons that Tocqueville pointed out were almost inevitable, he turns towards the central power more. As the central power takes up more of his life, it tears us apart. Another way of putting it is that the state often displaces civil society. Where the state exists, it should not be neutral on the questions we're talking about today. It should not be neutral on faith, family, and community. The government, the tax code should be pro-family. It should be pro-natal. It should be pro-community. And we shouldn't hesitate to say that. But we shouldn't invite the state into new parts of our lives because it drives out community. It replaces community not just in our lives, but also even in our imagination. I think that's part of the reason. It's not just a lack of reading their Tocqueville and their Jeremy Burnham that causes the Washington Post columnists to believe there's nothing besides the individual, the state, and the market. I think it is the fact that the state, when it grows, it drives out and displaces the community, and it makes us poorer. And so this is, I think, I'm trying to tee up some of the discussions, some of the disagreements we're going to have today. Absolutely, the government needs to, when it is involved, be biased in favor of the family and in favor of the community. But we have to realize that there are trade-offs, and that the fundamental work of restoring marriage and restoring community will not be something that the government can do. It will be done through what we always know has always built up community, what has always built up family, which is the organic, natural working together. As Tocqueville put it, the heart is enlarged and the human mind is developed only by the reciprocal action of men upon one another. And so that, I hope, is what underlies all of our conversation this weekend. Thank you very much.
Erika, go ahead.
Speak through here. All right, excellent. Thank you, Tim. That was excellent. And I obviously, I think, thoroughly agree with everything that you've said. I guess what I would say, I want to borrow from a quote of Alan Carlson's, the great kind of family historian, who I sort of repeatedly use this quote throughout my book, The Rights of Women, in which he talks about the sort of agrarian homestead and then also kind of the work of responding to industrializing forces. He said there's sort of this pre-modern island in the industrializing sea during the Industrial Revolution, and the way in which, in my work, I've shown that much of the work that the first wave of the women's movement does was to protect the family from that industrializing, sort of encroaching force. And I think the same could be said today in terms of the way in which we have other sorts of deracinating forces. Sometimes they're the state, and often they have something to do with the market or technology. And so I think a lot of the work that conservatives have to do in sort of putting the thumb on the family, sort of putting the thumb on the goods of the family, in terms of the thumb on the scale, is really as protection for what the family does. And again, those other sorts of institutions that support the family. I'll tell you, there's nothing that I've done other than, of course, raise 7 children, or in the process of raising 7 children, my husband, that has been better for the surrounding community than founding this classical school. We didn't know at the time. We thought it was just sort of like, oh, we'll have 25 people around, kids and all that. But the way in which this school and other schools around the country like it have created these, literally swarms of people, families moving themselves into our community so that other schools also are growing around them. And we actually have this like haven of, whether it's conservatism or Catholicism or something like that in Massachusetts. Imagine that. And don't tell anyone yet until we sort of seed ourselves and grow. We're about to build an enormous, beautiful classical classical architecture that I think is going to surprise some people driving by to see that actually these schools are really have planted themselves and are growing, and then maybe there's a renaissance of some sort going on. And so I guess I would say in that way, I'm fully in agreement that family and those family supportive institutions where a lot of contacts are made, right? It's not just friendship, but it is like contacts for work and all that. But I think we have to recognize the ways in which so many people in our country today lack not only family structure, but also those mediating institutions, as you said. And so what are the ways in which their work each day, or the schools they send their children to, or the tax code in terms of the marriage penalty, all of these different ways that they are actually being encouraged to have no children, fewer children, not to marry. And that's, I guess, the place that I would really look, is that certainly it can't be that we'd be displacing the work
of mothers and fathers. And as we've seen in some of our welfare policies, the displacement of fathers is a potential. And so we have to really think carefully about that. But what is the way in which we're encouraging, and I mean, a lot of this is things that everybody in this room would certainly be for, but it's just how are we encouraging more, more work in the trades, more technical education rather than college education, so that men can get back to work and have sort of the confidence to go and become fathers. Because it seems to me, I mean, I've seen this in my own life, just to get super personal for a moment. My mom was married and divorced 3 times, so did not grow up with a good family structure at all. But to see the way in which my own marriage, and then my brother too, who raised a child on his own, has just transformed both of us. It's not just the overturning of Roe v. Wade that hopefully will create more, allow more children to live, and therefore more people to become parents, and therefore more maturation to take place. So that kind of the decadence that technology and I think wealth has allowed can sort of creep back. And I guess so I would say a lot of workplace policy is what I would really want to focus on. I mean, just-in-time scheduling, it seems to me, ought to be just outlawed. And other ways in which, employees are at the beck and call of their employers, that the employers even want to act as though the work is replacing, the workplace is replacing the family. And so anyway, those ways that we can encourage, certainly not displace family and family supportive institutions.
Great. Tim?
Thank you. I also, as you suggest, should have pointed out that the over-centralization that's a problem is also an economic thing. It's not just over-centralization of government power, the government displacing civil society. It's over-centralized economy is bad for community. When the main streets in 5 towns are replaced by a strip mall that you all have to drive to, so you're not walking and bumping into your friends, and so you're driving, 80% of the people you see aren't your neighbors. That harms community, that harms family formation. So the over-centralization of our economy, our government, and our attention to. That man is a political animal, but more people know about Donald Trump's various trials than know about anything in their local politics. That's certainly a problem. And I think the last few years have only exacerbated the issue of the over-centralization. Workplace, I think, is absolutely a necessary thing here, and as far as being pro-family and being pro-community. And it's funny because there are a lot of workplaces that really do try to say, we support mothers, because that can have like a feminist tone. So we need to build that up. Yes, support mothers. Also support fathers. There's this really interesting study, and the New York Times had a great piece on it. I think it was Bain. They didn't name the consulting firm. Got hired. Bain hired Harvard University's gender and work department to say why everything we do, we hire 50% women, we do all this, but our partners are still 90% men. Why is it? What can we do to be more workplace friendly? And the women are like, well, the women you're losing, Harvard said the women you're losing are mostly mothers. Okay, so we're gonna have in-house daycare, we're gonna do that. It doesn't end up helping. And in the end, Harvard comes back, it's like, you know what, we interviewed people. The men are just as unhappy as the women in your company. It's just that the fathers in the company, when they leave at 6 p.m., everybody assumes they're going to a meeting. When the mothers leave, people say, oh, I guess she has to go home to her family. Well, I cite this in my forthcoming book. What I say is if Mary is leaving to go to her children and Mark is leaving to go to a meeting, then Mary really has chosen the better part. The men should be leaving to go home to their family, and the bosses should be telling them that. And so what women in the workplace need is not more daycare subsidies. I have no objection to paid parental leave, but that's not going to do nearly as much as people think it's going to do. It's going to be bosses who say your family's more important, and men who stand up at 5 and say, I got to go home, my family needs me. These are going to be cultural shifts. Companies have to make policies, and they have to take a side. And this is where, again, Erika and I agree. Discrimination is like the only crime in the eyes of lots of people in America. But we should be discriminating. I'll end on this, but there was a moment when Elizabeth Warren was running for president, and she said she got fired because her boss found out she was pregnant. And then there was a discussion about, pregnancy discrimination, and one of the people on the Washington Examiner commentary page with me said, well, here's the thing. Why should we go out of the way to accommodate family? If somebody's pregnant, they're going to miss work. Isn't that a valid consideration? It might make a boss a jerk to do it, but like you're going to be less productive. And he said, and by the way, I'm not married. I don't plan on having kids. I'm not religious. Thankfully, he is now, but he said, I'm not religious. But the Examiner, our old magazine editor, Seth Mandel's observant Jewish, and he said, we moved the deadline to Thursday so that he could always be home on Friday. Tim, when you go off and coach T-ball, we work schedules around you. You guys, what do you accommodate for me? And I thought about it, and I was like, you know what? It's right, we've made a decision. Family and faith are the most important things. You get a day off when your British soccer team, because they play at like 10 a.m. this time. When you want to be drinking and watching Arsenal or Chelsea or whatever, we let you have a day off for that. But yeah, Seth gets a day off every Friday because faith is more important. And so making that decision, coming down on a certain side, is something governments and employers ought to do. I absolutely agree. But again, I'm going to end with my warning that when pro-family policy, everything is family policy to some extent, but when we try to say the government in this case ought to be intervening and tipping scales for the family, if it's a new intervention into our life, it's going to end up displacing the real organic things that support family, which is community and extended family.
Thank you. Well, I have a number of questions lined up, but since family policy has emerged as an area of common discussion, I figure maybe we'll start there. And Erika, I'll start with you. So just as a little bit of background, Erika and I both just signed on to a letter calling upon the United States Senate to structure paid family leave in certain ways, so that way it will be more supportive of mothers and not emphasize fatherhood too much, and also will not erase the language of mothers by saying that that this policy should be supporting of all birthing persons was how the language was. But that brings me to my question: is there a risk of saying that family policy should be the kind of organizing principle of practically everything we do, that we overstretch family policy to the point where it loses its meaning and also its effectiveness? It's like, I fear, it's like the use of the term infrastructure in Build Back Better. Build Back Better, everything was infrastructure, and it just ended up being a grab bag of everything progressives wanted. Mm-hmm. So how do we, if we are going to pursue family policy, how do we pursue it in such a way that we can limit it so that way it's coherent and effective?
Yeah, that's good. And I guess what I mean is the way in which every policy that we can sort of imagine, although I'm sure someone could find one that didn't impact, but there's a way in which the family is always impacted. And so we think about a good analogy that I actually, just to say, social capital I think should be replaced with social ecology, which is generally what people used in sort of Aaron Glendon and others in the communitarian movement. But I think in the same way, the analogy can be made that, for a long time, whether or not you agree with them, there have been environmental impact statements or environmental impact that we look and see how is this going to impact the environment in different localities or whatever. And I think something similar could be done with how this impacts and sort of think clearly. I mean, this is what lawyers are trained to do, at least, is to think sort of about the hypotheticals in which how is it that the family could be impacted. And I'll go to that, actually, the parental leave. I mean, parental leave is a great place where there's been a debate within sort of people thinking about women and work, about the sort of strict equality types and those who think, and this goes all the way back before Alice Paul, the original author of the ERA and all that, thinking about when women were first sort of forced into the industrial workplace is like, how do you think about, are women members of families with these real responsibilities and disproportionate responsibilities to their children, or are they sort of strictly like, ungendered individuals who should be sort of strictly equal to men? And I think those are really important tensions to work out. And the way I've come down, though I'm still really thinking this through, for sure, not just historically and philosophically, but also legally in terms of anti-discrimination law, is that I think there's a way in which employers seem to do best when they give flexibility to everyone, when they make sure that their policies are that sort of life and family, of course, and all these things come before because of the formation of the human person, and that work is a means toward that. But that the state can sort of pick more favorites. So in other words, when a workplace says, just parents and religious people, I think that's great in that particular workplace. But some other places, if you just said mothers are given, this kind of time and not fathers, or just parents and not non-parents, there's a way in which people get very resentful, and it's not a great, and this is just studies have shown it's not as great a workplace environment. But if you say sort of flexibility for all, let's talk about the community and the community's needs, that kind of makes sense. On the other hand, with regard to the state, it seems to me that there are certain ways in which the state can respond, state localities, whether it's the states, the 50 states, or occasionally the federal government can respond to the real asymmetries, especially reproductive asymmetries. So in that letter, and the Supreme Court has said it's okay to recognize the real reproductive asymmetry, the real disproportionate burdens, and of course privileges that are upon a woman because she's the one who bears a child. And so I think that really has to be seen in the way that we've sort of taken the strict equality lens and flattened out all difference, especially with regard to sex differences as well, where we are today with regard to these however they're calling women these days. So anyway, I guess those would be my chief comments.
Tim, so your analysis is that there's an absolutization of the market and the state that makes individuals in duress appeal to them for succor. And you you point out that the root problem is the lack of connection and the decline of community, and also obviously the decline of family. So if we're looking for, my question is, if we're looking for the very same layer of civil society to be the thing that kind of renews itself and provides us with the things that it's lacking, how can we call upon a civil society which is in decline to restore itself in order to provide us with the things that we currently need for our families?
Well, we certainly, my first answer would be our primary work has to be restoring community and getting out of the way of community when we're in the way. If we're looking to solve these problems, there's a limit to how much we can do through technocratic direct policy means, things that need to be done socially and organically. Restoring civil society is difficult, as you point out. When Nisbet defined alienation, he said it wasn't just that people were disconnected from society, it's that they didn't see the point in it. So this was something he saw back in the 1960s. And so when people don't see it, don't see the point, it's hard to stir it up. But in a lot of places, there still exist institutions that are weakened and that don't have as many people connected to it. And so my first thing would be to say to use philanthropy, to use activism, to use journalism in the books that we write, and to tweak government policy, all with an aim of propping up institutions that exist in communities. And if you look at what a lot of the nonprofits these days are doing, Communio is a pro-marriage nonprofit that sort of spun out of the Philanthropy Roundtable, and it said, why are people getting divorced more, getting married less? And it found that the answer was a lack of connection and community. That it's harder to meet somebody, it's harder to see what marriage is supposed to look like, it's harder to stay together if you don't have social support. So their way of saving marriages is to give couples friends. And that's an oversimplification. But there are a lot of nonprofits and a lot of philanthropy is aimed at that. On the book tour for Alienated America, I met group social workers who were definitely on the political left, and they said, a program never helped anybody. Relationships help people. So we reorganize our programs to be building relationships. So there are ways, even though civil society is something that grows up organically, there are ways to fertilize it.
Tim, I have a follow-up for you. This is a question that springs from my reading of your book. And so I'm going to read a few passages from the book, which I think are extremely perceptive and enlightening. The disappearance of reliable jobs, you write, and the erosion of local community may look like two different things that happen in the same places. In a crucial way, though, they are the same thing. Cohesive communities and a regular workplace are both institutions of civil society. Institutions of civil society provide material resources such as pay and a support structure, but they also provide more abstract resources such as a sense of security and a sense of purpose. If pay and family stability go together, it's because both depend on the same thing, social capital. So that's the first quote. Here, you're referring to the 45th President of the United States and his appeal. You say Trump's protectionist talk and critique of free trade help explain the shift. The shift being foreign trade, particularly with China, hit some parts of the country and some skill sets very hard. The studies showed that competition with China didn't merely set a lower equilibrium wage, for low-skilled workers forced to move into the service sector. It destroyed towns. We saw it in Fayette County, and if you've driven through Detroit, you've seen it too. Beautiful homes crumbling to the ground, street after street with commercial lots all boarded up. Things didn't just get poorer, the places died. But not everybody left. Those who stayed suffered the social woes of less marriage, less childbirth, less church, more drugs, more alcohol, more disability. In short, community and family crumbled in these places. And you go from there to comment on the value of unions, which I have to admit I was a little surprised to see in here. The value of unions providing social solidarity to these workers whose communities had been literally destroyed, on your telling, because their businesses had gone up and gone to China or had been gone elsewhere. So what is your vision for unions given what I've just read? What place do they have in the rebuilding of social capital in the United States?
Thank you, and I did intentionally include problems like that I didn't have great solutions to, in part because I'm a journalist and B, a conservative. So I'm better at stating problems than solutions. But I could answer the union thing in a couple ways. One, I do believe that there was a guy I quote in the book, Joe Adams, who told me he got laid off from a factory job at GE in Indiana. And he told me that when he first interviewed for the job, they said, well, do you have skills? And he said, this is a factory job. I didn't think it was really a skilled job. I thought you could teach me everything I need to know in a morning. And they said, well, what I mean by skills is, do you show up on time? Do you work to the whistle? Can you stand to do the same thing again and again, same with monotony for 30 years? And when I was thinking about that years later, I realized they're kind of describing the skills of being a husband and a father. I mean, you don't actually need to know how to cook and changing diapers. You can learn in a morning. Some of us took a little longer, but thankfully with 6 kids, I got tons of practice and became a pro. That the unions and the factories didn't just give people a paycheck. They trained people for the skills of being a parent and a father. And I don't know if I could go back in time and protect those factories with tariffs, whether I would do it. I might. But if we tried to bring them back today, they would not be filled by union workers. They would be filled by robots. The factories wouldn't come back. But the role I lay out in the last chapter, the sort of solutions chapter, which again is a little sparse because it's not my strong point, but one of the solutions I really do believe in is that unions were, and could be institutions of civil society that provide that sort of networking, mentoring, support, belonging, but that their current structure is so regulated and legalistic. It's so lawyered up. If a majority of your workplace votes to unionize, the employer has to recognize it. That unions are about, well, we're not going to do anything, that we're going to work to the letter of the union deal, and that they're not about the sort of voluntary reciprocal action that a real institution of civil society is. And Northern Europe has a model that I looked at, not in depth, but enough to say, wait a second. In Northern Europe, people voluntarily join the unions because they provide the unemployment insurance. Employers voluntarily do business with the unions because that's the only way to get the best, most reliable workers. And the unions see themselves, again, as places to train workers, to provide benefits, whether it's family benefits or insurance-type benefits. I think that our current system is so legalized, where the unions got a law passed and then the employers did, and it was just this constant escalation of distrust. Erika started with the word trust there. There has to be trust for something to work as a civil society. So that would be my vision of unions. It would involve totally scrapping our current system and starting over again, but there are models of it elsewhere.
Erika, you mentioned you mentioned in an essay that I recently read for American Compass, which was excellent. Pardon me, I've forgotten the title. And in your comments, in response to Tim, that you see flexibility as a, in response to my question, I should say, you see flexibility as a principle that can be applied to make sure that the family is being given its just due in the marketplace. But Tim has written, and as you will acknowledge, part-time, so there are certain forms of flexibility in the marketplace that actually can create conditions for exploitation, such as if you're an Uber driver where you cannot have legal representation, and there are other things like task working, which happens over like highly digitized spaces where you cannot even put your name forward as the laborer who's doing the work on behalf of a very large corporation like Amazon. So how do we keep flexibility from becoming a condition of exploitation, and how do we make sure that it is something that provides for the flourishing of families?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would just mention, which was implicit in something Tim said, but is the way in which we'll see, and this is a lot of, why we see a pay gap still, is the ways in which mothers will choose flexibility over money. And I think that's a great thing in general. Is there a way in which, employees could be taken advantage of? Certainly, and that's why I think the state does have to step in certain ways in which, when there's like big companies like Uber, who just got me here really late, and others, I think that the only institution that's big enough, it's not going to be the individual, whether it's the Uber driver or whatever, who's going to be able to fight, at least at this point, unless a union, some sort of union is formed. So I think the state just does have to step in, as we always do, for sort of, in terms of the regulatory state, in terms of laws that govern how it is that we order our lives together. And with these new sorts of industries, there have to be laws that accompany it, just like the tech industry. And I think we would be sort of naive to think that that wouldn't be the case. So how would we do that? Again, outlawing just-in-time scheduling, but then incentivizing in some way that it's, and I'm not sure exactly how this would happen, but that it would be employee-directed flexibility rather than employer-directed flexibility. And I just think it's putting like the health of the family and the health of the work that mothers and fathers do, or if it's others who need flexibility for care of elderly or for going on their surfboard, whatever it is, that the flexibility is put first, put sort of for the good of the employee, and that is somehow written into some sort of legislation. And again, I have to sit down with people who actually craft legislation to do that. Yeah.
Patrick Brown's.
Yeah, Patrick Brown.
I do just want to reemphasize, though, that tension is real. Predictability and flexibility are in tension. And I wrote in Illuminates America about how predictability is necessary for family because you've got to be able to plan for the next 30 years. But I'm writing in Family and Friendly about how flexibility is necessary for parents. And Claudia Goldin, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has basically said that's the entirety of the pay gap, is that mothers decide flexibility. So this is one of the ways in which legislation aimed at these problems can create vexing new problems. If we mandate predictability, we can handicap flexibility. If we mandate flexibility, we can handicap predictability.
Yeah, but and I would just say we don't mandate in sort of global theories. We mandate in pretty minute, discrete ways, right? So it's restrictions on just-in-time scheduling is making sure that a person is given a schedule well in advance. It could be a flexible schedule, and that would be good, but that it's given with enough time to secure help for children and all of that.
Well, we're out of time. Thanks to Tim and Erika and to ISI for hosting this wonderful panel.